The jungle of Varath 9 wanted to kill everything that breathed, and it was very good at its job. Mira Ose knew this better than most people twice her age, because she had lived on this death world since she was 4 years old, and the planet had been trying to eat her ever since she took her first steps outside the research station. She was 9 now, small for her age, dark-skinned and wiry, with a mess of braids her mother tied fresh every Sunday, and hands that were already rough from climbing trees and pulling roots, and doing all the things a child had to do when home was a metal box in the middle of a jungle that hated you. Her parents were xenobiologists, which meant they studied alien life, and Varath 9 had more alien life than anyone could study in 100 lifetimes, most of it with claws and teeth and a deep personal interest in finding out what humans tasted like. The research station sat in a clearing they had burned out of the jungle with plasma torches 3 years ago, and every single day the jungle tried to take that clearing back, vines crawling up the walls at night, root systems cracking the foundation, flying things with wingspans wider than Mira was tall, circling overhead like they were waiting for someone to step outside at the wrong moment. Mira loved it. She loved the way the air smelled like copper and wet leaves after a storm, the way the bioluminescent fungi painted the forest floor in pale blue light when the sun went down, the way you could hear the whole jungle breathing if you sat still long enough. Her father said she had no survival instinct, and her mother said she had the best survival instinct of anyone in the family, because she was the only one who actually paid attention to what the jungle was telling her. It was on a Tuesday, though Mira did not know it was a Tuesday, because days of the week meant very little on a planet where the sun rose and set every 19 hours, that she found Sargent. She had been walking one of her usual trails about half a kilometer from the station, collecting fungal samples for her mother, when she heard something thrashing in the undergrowth off to her left, a wet snarling sound mixed with a high-pitched whine that she had never heard any native creature make. She pushed through the ferns and found him. He was a honey badger, or what was left of one, a gene-modded Terran honey badger about the size of a large house cat, one of a batch that had been released into the colony zone years ago to deal with a burrowing pest problem. And something very large and very mean had gotten hold of him. His left side was torn open, 3 deep gashes running from shoulder to hip, where claws had raked through his thick skin, and one of his ears was half gone, and he was covered in so much blood that Mira could not tell what color his fur was supposed to be. He was also still fighting, even lying on his side, in the mud with his guts half showing. He was snapping and snarling at the air, like he expected whatever had hurt him to come back so he could bite it again. Mira knelt down beside him, and he twisted around and bit her hand so hard that his teeth went through her glove and into the meat of her palm, and she did not pull away. She looked at him, bleeding and furious and refusing to die, and she said to him very calmly, "That is enough of that. You are coming home with me." She wrapped him in her jacket, and he bit her 3 more times on the way back to the station, and she did not flinch once. Her father told her the animal was going to die, and there was no point wasting medical supplies on it. And Mira looked at him with the particular expression that her mother called the face, and her father sighed and got the surgical kit. The honey badger survived because honey badgers always survive. That was the whole point of being a honey badger. And over the following weeks, as Mira fed him and cleaned his wounds, and sat beside his recovery crate, talking to him in a low, steady voice, something changed in the way the creature looked at her. She named him Sergeant, because he growled at everyone like he was giving orders, and nothing was ever good enough for him. By the 2nd month, Sergeant followed Mira everywhere, not like a pet follows its owner, but like a bodyguard follows the person they would kill for, always a step behind her, always watching, always ready. He slept outside her bedroom door, and God help anyone who made a loud noise near it during the night. Her father learned this the hard way, when he dropped a tool crate at 2 in the morning, and Sergeant came around the corner like a small furry missile, and latched onto his boot, and would not let go until Mira came out and told him it was fine. He bit the supply drone pilot, he bit a visiting researcher, he bit a native lizard thing that wandered too close to the station. Then he dragged its body to Mira's door, like a gift. Mira's mother watched all of this, and said that the creature had decided Mira was his to protect, and there was nothing in the known universe more dangerous than a honey badger that had chosen its person. Meanwhile, far above them, in the black silence of space, things were happening that Mira did not know about, and would not have understood if someone had explained them to her. The Galactic Union, which was the closest thing the galaxy had to a government, was a vast coalition of hundreds of alien species that had been cooperating and competing, and occasionally trying to wipe each other out, for longer than Earth had had multicellular life. Humanity was new to all of this, a young species that had stumbled into faster-than-light travel barely a century ago, and had been colonizing worlds with a cheerful recklessness that the rest of the galaxy found either charming or terrifying, depending on which species you asked. The Veltari Dominion did not find it charming. The Veltari were insectoid, hive-minded, and deeply militaristic, with an empire that spanned 40 star systems, and an army that had never lost a war of conquest. And they had been expanding into the frontier territories for 3 standard years now, swallowing colony worlds one by one. And nobody in the Galactic Union had done much of anything about it, because the Veltari were powerful, and the colonies they were taking belonged to minor species that did not have enough votes in the Union Assembly to matter. Verith 9 was in their path. The first sign was a flicker on the long-range scanner that Mira's father checked every evening out of habit. 3 contacts at the edge of the system, moving in a formation that was not natural and was not commercial traffic. He stared at the screen for a long time, and then he called Mira's mother over, and they spoke in low voices that Mira could not hear from her room, where she sat with Sergeant on her lap, scratching the spot behind his remaining ear that made his back leg kick. The second sign was the emergency broadcast from the main colony hub, 200 kilometers to the east. A burst of static and shouting, and then a voice saying that ships were descending and they were not human. And then the voice was replaced by a sound that Mira had never heard before, but that she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. The sound of plasma bombardment hitting a populated area. Then there was silence. Mira's father turned off the comms panel and looked at her mother, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. Outside, the jungle breathed, and above the canopy, new stars were moving that had not been there the night before. And Sergeant sat on Mira's lap and growled at the ceiling, as if he could smell what was coming. Her father moved with a speed that Mira had never seen from him before. The slow, careful scientist replaced by someone harder and sharper and more frightened than she had ever imagined he could be. He grabbed Mira by the arm and pulled her through the station, while her mother ran ahead, opening doors and punching codes into keypads, and neither of them explained anything, because there was no time to explain. Beneath the main laboratory, there was a room that Mira had been told was for storing biological samples, a reinforced vault built to survive the kind of seismic activity that Verith 9 liked to throw at them every few months, with walls thick enough to block radiation, and a door that sealed with a hiss of pressurized air. Her father put her inside it. He put a pack on the floor beside her, rations and water and a medical kit, and a small device that Mira recognized as an emergency beacon, the kind that sent a repeating distress signal on a frequency that only human ships could detect. Sergeant was already there, because Sergeant went wherever Mira went, and no force in the galaxy had yet proven capable of stopping him. Her mother knelt in front of her, and held her face in both hands, and Mira could feel her fingers trembling, and she said to Mira in a voice that was steady, even though her eyes were not, "You stay here, and you stay quiet, and you do not open this door for anyone except us. Do you understand me?" Mira nodded. Her father stood behind her mother, and he looked at Mira the way he looked at things he was trying to memorize, and he said, "If everything goes wrong, climb to the spire. You know where it is. The relay booster is there. You can send a signal that will punch through anything." Mira did not understand why he was telling her this, but she nodded again, because the look on his face told her that arguing was not something she was allowed to do right now. Her mother kissed her forehead, and her father put his hand on top of her head for just a moment, and then they stepped back, and the vault door closed, and Mira was alone in the dark with Sergeant and the sound of her own breathing. She sat on the cold metal floor and pulled Sergeant into her lap and waited. The sounds came slowly at first, a distant rumbling that she felt more than heard. Vibrations traveling through the earth and up through the floor of the vault, and Mira pressed her hands flat against the metal and tried to read the story the shaking was telling her. Then closer sounds, a sharp crack that was the outer perimeter fence being breached, a series of rapid pops that she knew were her father's plasma rifle, because he had let her hold it once, and she remembered the sound it made when he tested it. Voices, or something like voices, a clicking, chittering language that rose and fell in patterns that sounded wrong to human ears, and beneath it, a mechanical hum that Mira guessed was the drones she had heard about from colony broadcasts, the ones the Velthari used to clear buildings. Her father's rifle fired again and again, and then it stopped. Her mother screamed. It was a sound that went into Mira's ears and down through her chest and buried itself somewhere behind her ribs, where it would live for the rest of her life. A sound that was cut short in a way that told Mira everything she needed to know and everything she did not want to know. Then there was silence. Sergeant growled, a low rumbling vibration that Mira felt against her stomach, where he was pressed against her. And she put her hand over his muzzle and held it there and whispered, "Quiet, please be quiet." He was quiet. The first day passed, and Mira did not move except to drink water and to let Sergeant eat from the ration pack, and to press her ear against the vault door and listen to the sounds of alien soldiers moving through the station above her, their clicking language, and the scrape of their limbs on the metal floors. The second day she cried, once and hard, and with her face buried in Sergeant's fur so the sound would not carry. And when she was done, she wiped her eyes and drank more water and did not cry again. The third day, she heard the drones. They were searching the station more carefully now. She could tell by the pattern of their movement, the systematic way they went room by room, and she heard the sound of walls being cut open and floors being pulled up, and she knew they were looking for something or someone, and she knew it was her. Sergeant heard them too, and he stood up on her lap with every hair on his body bristling, and his lips pulled back from his teeth, and his eyes fixed on the vault door with an intensity that was almost human. The sound of metal being pried apart came from directly above them, and then from the door itself, a high whine of cutting tools working through the seal. And Mira grabbed her pack and put it on her back, and picked up the beacon and held Sergeant against her chest and back to the far wall. The door screamed open, and light poured in, harsh and white and alien, and in the doorway stood a Veltari drone, a machine the size of a large dog, with too many legs, and a sensor array where a face should have been, and a plasma emitter mounted on its back that swiveled toward Mira with a click. Sergeant launched. He left Mira's arms like something fired from a gun, a blur of gray-brown thur and absolute fury, and he hit the drone square in its sensor array and began tearing it apart with his claws and teeth, ripping through optical cables and sensor housings with a savagery that was almost beautiful in its completeness. The drone spun and thrashed, and its plasma emitter fired wild, scorching a line across the ceiling and then across Sergeant's left flank, where it burned through fur and skin, and the smell of it filled the vault. But Sergeant did not let go, because letting go was not something Sergeant did. Not ever. not for any reason. Behind the drone, a Veltari soldier appeared in the corridor, tall and segmented and wrong-looking in every way that Mira's brain could process. And it raised a weapon, and Sergeant twisted the drone's body between himself and the shot, and the plasma bolt hit the drone instead, and the machine collapsed. Mira ran. She went through the gap between the dead drone and the wall, and she ran down the corridor and up the stairs, and through the ruined station where everything she had known was broken and burned, and she did not look at the things on the floor that she knew were there, because looking would stop her, and stopping would kill her. Sergeant was beside her, limping badly, the plasma burn on his flank weeping fluid, and his fur matted with blood, both his and the drone's, but he kept pace with her, because that was what he did. They burst through the shattered front door of the station, hit the jungle at a dead sprint, Mira crashing through undergrowth that tore at her clothes and skin, Sergeant plowing through it beside her like a small, angry tank. And behind them, the Veltari shouted in their clicking language, and drones lifted into the air with a whine of motors. The jungle swallowed them. Vareth Nine's jungle was thick and dark and hostile to everything that moved through it, but Mira had been moving through it since she was 4 years old, and she knew it the way she knew her own hands, every trail and stream and hollow tree and hidden cave. And she ran not in a straight line, but in the way the jungle wanted her to run, following animal paths that wound and doubled back and crossed over each other, until any trail she left was tangled beyond following. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook, and the sounds of pursuit had faded behind her. And then she ran some more. When she finally stopped, it was at a place she knew, beneath a rock overhang, where a freshwater spring trickled down the stone, and the entrance was hidden by a curtain of hanging vines, one of a dozen hiding spots she had mapped during her years of exploring. She crawled inside, and Sergeant crawled in after her, and collapsed against her side, his breathing ragged and wet-sounding, and his eyes half-closed, but still open, and still watching the cave entrance. Mira looked at him in the dim green light that filtered through the vines. He was hurt badly, and she was hurt too, scrapes and cuts all over her arms, and a deep gash on her knee from a rock she had hit during her run. And they were alone on a death world, with an alien army between them and any hope of rescue. She opened her pack and found the medical kit, and began cleaning Sergeant's burn with hands that shook only a little. And while she worked, she talked to him in the same low, steady voice she had used when she first found him bleeding in the jungle all those months ago. "We are going to be okay, Sergeant. We just have to be meaner than them." Sergeant looked at her with his black eyes and growled softly, and licked her wrist, and then went back to watching the cave entrance. Outside, the jungle breathed and clicked and hummed with things that wanted to eat them. And somewhere beyond the canopy, alien ships hung in the sky like new constellations. And Mira Osei, 9 years old, alone, orphaned, and hunted, Overseer Kethral had conquered 11 worlds in his career, and he had never once lost sleep over any of them. He was Velthari, which meant he was born to command and to conquer, and to fold lesser species into the great machinery of the Dominion. And he was good at it, efficient and thorough and utterly without sentiment. The kind of officer that High Command gave the difficult assignments to, because they knew he would finish them without wasting time or resources. Varath 9 should have been simple. A minor human colony on a death world, poorly defended, far from any significant military assets. The kind of target that the Dominion consumed like a passing snack on its way to more important meals. The orbital bombardment had gone perfectly, and the main colony hub had fallen in hours, and the scattered research stations in the jungle had been mooted out, one by one, with minimal resistance. And Kethral had filed his initial report to High Command with the confidence of someone who expected to be moving on to the next system within a standard week. That was before the jungle started eating his soldiers. The first patrol to go missing was Squad 7, a standard reconnaissance unit of 8 soldiers and 2 drones sent to survey the river basin sector southeast of the primary landing zone. They did not report in at their scheduled check time, and when Kethral sent a drone to their last known position, he found all 8 soldiers dead, not from combat, but from a toxic reaction. Their exoskeletons blistered and cracked and leaking fluid, and the drones smashed and scattered across the jungle floor. The trail they had been following was smeared with something, a clear sticky substance that Kethral's science officers later identified as the sap of a native plant that was harmless to most species but catastrophically toxic to Velthari chitin. Someone had put it there on purpose. Another patrol, and this one walked into a deadfall trap. 3 massive logs suspended in the canopy by vine fiber ropes that snapped when a tripwire was triggered. And 2 soldiers were crushed instantly, and a third was so badly wounded that he had to be carried back to base. These were not accidents, and these were not natural hazards, and Kethral knew it, but what he could not understand was who was doing it, because there were no human survivors in this sector, according to every scan and every sweep his forces had conducted. Then the sentries started dying. It happened at night, always at night, when the jungle was at its darkest and Velthari compound eyes were at their weakest. And it was always the same. A sentry posted at the edge of camp would go silent, and when someone went to check, they would find the sentry down with its throat torn open by something with teeth and claws, something small and fast and impossibly vicious. Whatever it was, it left tracks in the mud, and Kethral's trackers studied them, and told him the tracks belonged to a small Terran mammal, something called a honey badger. And Kethral asked them if they were joking, and they told him they were not. He doubled the sentries, and the attacks continued, and the small creatures seemed to have no fear at all. It would hit a sentry and vanish into the undergrowth before anyone could respond, and the soldiers it attacked died, not from the initial bite, but from the way the creature held on and kept tearing, as if it had decided that this particular Velthari needed to die, and nothing else mattered until that was accomplished. The traps got worse. Patrols began walking into snare lines that hoisted soldiers into the canopy, where the flying predators of Vareth 9 found them, and tore them apart before anyone could cut them down. A supply cache was contaminated with native fungi that spread through the ration containers and made an entire platoon too sick to fight for. 3 days. A drone was found with its power cables chewed through, just chewed, as if something had walked up to it and bitten through the cables and walked away. And then the stampede happened. Kethral still did not fully understand how it was done, but somehow a herd of native megafauna, massive 6-legged creatures with armored skulls, and a territorial aggression that made them one of the most dangerous animals on the planet, was driven directly through the center of his forward camp. The herd destroyed 4 structures, killed 6 soldiers, and scattered supplies across a square kilometer of jungle. And in the chaos that followed, someone raided the medical tent and took antibiotics and wound dressings and a plasma cauterizer, and vanished back into the trees without leaving a single footprint on the muddy ground. Someone small enough that the sensor grid had not registered them. Kethral began to put the pieces together, and he did not like the picture. They formed. He pulled drone footage from every camera in the sector, and ran it through pattern analysis, and the results made his antennae flatten against his skull in a way that meant something very close to human horror. The traps were not random. They were placed along specific patrol routes, with a precision that meant whoever was placing them had been watching his soldiers for days before acting. The toxic sap was harvested from plants that grew only in specific locations and transported to the trap sites, which meant the person responsible knew this jungle intimately. The attacks came at night because Velthari vision was poorest in darkness, and whoever was doing this knew that too. And the animal, the small Terran predator, was not acting alone. It was working with someone, scouting ahead and identifying targets, and then the traps would appear and the attacks would follow in a sequence that spoke of planning and coordination. Began refusing to go on night patrols. Hive-born warriors who had conquered worlds were jumping at shadows and clustering together in groups, and checking the trees above them with a nervous frequency that made Kethril want to execute someone for cowardice. The Valtari were bred for formation warfare, massed ranks and overwhelming firepower, and the absolute certainty that the hive was stronger than any individual. And this invisible scratching, gnawing thing in the jungle, this was something they had no training for and no instinct to handle. A soldier did not fear an enemy army because the hive was bigger, but a soldier very much feared the dark thing that came at night and took you one by one while you screamed and nobody could see where it came from. Morale was collapsing, and Kethril could feel it in the way his officers spoke to him, faster and higher pitched, the clicking cadence of anxiety running through every report. Platoons from the main occupation force to hunt what his soldiers had started calling the Jungle Ghost. And those platoons lost 9 soldiers in their first week to traps and animal attacks, and one spectacular incident where a patrol was led into a swamp basin that turned out to be the nesting ground of an aquatic predator that pulled 4 soldiers under the water and did not let them come back up. Kethril was standing in his command tent, staring at a tactical map that was covered in red markers showing attacks and losses, when his communications officer brought him something that a damaged drone had recorded before its cameras were destroyed. It was a single image, blurred and dark, and taken in the split second before the drone died, and it showed a small figure crouched in the undergrowth. A human child, a girl, covered head to toe in mud and dried blood, with her hair matted and her eyes wide and bright in the camera flash, and beside her, pressed against her leg, was a small, gray-brown animal with black eyes that caught the light like 2 burning coals. Kethril stared at the image for a very long time. He transmitted it to Valthari High Command with a report detailing his losses and requesting additional forces. And the response came back within hours. First disbelief that a child and a small mammal had caused this much damage, then mockery from officers who had never set foot on a death world, and finally an order delivered with the cold authority of the Dominion. Destroy it or be replaced. Kethril looked at the image one more time, at the child's face, at the animal beside her, at the mud and blood, and the absolute absence of fear in both pairs of eyes. And for the first time in 11 campaigns, he felt something he could not name, crawling up his spine. Mira had been living in the jungle for 23 days, and she had become something that her parents would not have recognized. She was thinner now, her ribs showing through the torn remnants of her shirt, and her skin was covered in a patchwork of healing cuts and bruises and insect bites, and the long pink scar on her left forearm, where a Valthari plasma bolt had grazed her during a close call on day 9. Her braids were gone, impossible to maintain in the jungle, and her hair was a wild tangle that she had tied back with strips of vine because it kept getting in her eyes. She had learned to move through the undergrowth without making a sound, and she had learned to sleep in 30-minute intervals with one hand on Sergeant, and she had learned to kill things when she needed to, and to do it without hesitating. She was 9 years old, and she was the most dangerous thing in this jungle, and the Valthari were only just beginning to understand that. Was also tired, and she was running out of time. The antibiotics she had stolen from the Valthari medical tent were keeping the infection in her knee at bay. But they would not last forever, and the wound was getting worse, not better. And Sergeant's plasma burn had healed into a thick, ugly scar, but he was favoring his right side more than he used to, and sometimes at night she heard him whimpering in his sleep. The Valthari were adapting too, slowly and clumsily, but adapting, bringing in more drones with better sensors, and cutting wider patrol corridors through the jungle, and burning sections of forest to deny her cover. She could not keep this up, and she knew it. On the 23rd night, she sat in her current hiding spot, a hollow beneath the root system of a massive tree, and she turned her father's emergency beacon over in her hands and thought about what he had told her. If everything goes wrong, climb to the spire. About 12 kilometers northeast of the research station, a jagged column of black stone that rose nearly 200 meters above the jungle canopy, the highest point in the region. Her parents had installed a deep space relay booster at its summit years ago to amplify their research transmissions, a device powerful enough to push a signal across multiple star systems. And if Mira could reach it and connect her emergency beacon to it, the signal would punch through the Velthari jamming net like a fist through paper. The problem was that the Velthari had established a forward operating base at the foot of the spire. She knew this because she had spent 3 days watching it from the tree line, counting soldiers and drones, and noting patrol schedules and shift changes with the same patient attention her mother had used when studying animal behavior. Mira had learned something important about the Velthari during her weeks in the jungle, something that their reputation as fearsome conquerors had hidden from the rest of the galaxy. They were predictable. Their patrols followed the same routes at the same times, because hive-minded soldiers operated on schedules, and deviating from the schedule was not something that came naturally to them. Their drones swept in fixed patterns, because the algorithms were standardized across the Dominion, and nobody had thought to change them for a death world. Their sentries watched outward, because the threat was supposed to come from outside the perimeter, always from outside, because the idea that something might already be inside was not something their tactical doctrine accounted for. Mira spent 4 days preparing. She moved through the jungle like a ghost, gathering materials and placing them in specific locations along a route she had mapped in her head. A route that wound through the densest jungle between her position and the spire, plants, and filled hollow seed pods with it, and placed them in the canopy above the main trail leading to the Velthari base. She found a grove of firebulb trees, plants that produced large seed pods filled with a volatile oil that ignited on contact with air when the pod was ruptured. And she spent a full day carefully cutting them free and carrying them one by one to positions around the base perimeter. She located the nesting area of a herd of the armored megafauna that had worked so well before, and she mapped their paths and their triggers, the sounds and smells that made them charge. She built snare lines and deadfalls and pit traps along every approach route that the Velthari might use to pursue her, and she tested each one and adjusted them and tested them again. Sergeant watched her work, with his head tilted to one side and his black eyes following her hands. And sometimes he would sniff something she had placed, and sneeze, and look at her with an expression that in a human would have been, "Are you sure about this?" She was not sure about any of it, but being sure was a luxury she could not afford. On the night she had chosen, a night when the cloud cover was thick and the jungle was at its darkest, Mira began. She started with the megafauna. She had collected the scent glands of a predator species that the armored creatures feared and hated, and she had smeared them on rocks along a path that led directly toward the Velthari base. And now she crushed the last gland at the edge of the herd's sleeping area, and the big animals woke up smelling predator, and did what armored creatures with tiny brains and enormous bodies always did when they smelled danger. They stampeded. The ground shook as 20 tons of angry megafauna thundered through the jungle toward the Velthari base, and Mira ran parallel to them, staying just inside the tree line, and as the herd hit the perimeter, she triggered the firebulbs. Night lit up. Pods of volatile oil burst across the base in a chain of bright orange fireballs that set tents and supply stacks and drone charging stations ablaze, and the Velthari soldiers poured out of their shelters into a chaos of fire and stampeding animals and screaming, and Mira watched just long enough to see their formations break apart before she turned and ran for the spire. Sergeant was ahead of her, a gray-brown streak moving through the undergrowth, and twice he veered sharply to avoid drone positions that Mira had not seen, and she followed his lead without questioning because trusting Sergeant had kept her alive this long. She reached the base of the spire and looked up. 200 meters of sheer black stone rising into the cloud cover above her, slick with moisture, and dotted with tiny ledges and cracks that her parents had used climbing equipment to ascend. Equipment she did not have. She had her hands and her feet, and she had Sergeant who could not climb sheer rock. She picked him up and put him inside her pack, with his head sticking out over her shoulder, and he growled at this indignity, but he did not struggle, because he knew, the way he always seemed to know, that she needed him to be still. Mira began to climb. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than running from the station. Harder than the weeks of hiding and fighting, because every meter was a battle against gravity and exhaustion and the pain in her infected knee and the weight of a full-grown honey badger on her back. Her fingers bled where the rough stone tore them open, and her arms shook, and twice she slipped and caught herself on ledges that were barely wider than her hand. And she did not look down, because looking down was not something she could survive right now. A plasma bolt hissed past her head and hit the rock above her, showering her with stone fragments, and she looked down, despite herself. At the base of the spire, Velthari soldiers who had broken away from the chaos of the camp, and they were pointing up at her and firing. She climbed faster. Sergeant snarled over her shoulder at the lights below, and Mira said through gritted teeth, "Not now, Sergeant. Let me work." The bolts hit around her, but the angle was bad and she was small, and the cloud cover made targeting difficult, and she climbed with the desperate speed of someone who knew that stopping meant dying. Her hand found the summit ledge, and she pulled herself over it, and collapsed onto the flat stone platform at the top of the spire, gasping and shaking and bleeding from a dozen places. The relay booster was there, a squat metal box bolted to the rock, and Mira crawled to it and opened the access panel and pulled the emergency beacon from her pocket and connected it with hands that were so torn and bloody that she could barely grip the cable. The booster hummed to life, and the signal went out, boosted beyond anything the Velthari jamming net could contain. A scream across the void that carried Mira's voice in a repeating loop. "This is Mira Ose. Verith 9 Research Station 7. Coordinates follow. They killed everyone. This is Mira Ose. They killed everyone." 3 star systems away, a communications officer on a human warship sat up straight in her chair and said, "Captain, you need to hear this." On the summit of the spire, Mira pulled Sergeant out of the pack and held him in her lap, and looked down at the lights of the Velthari army converging at the base of the rock column below her. Hundreds of them, and she could hear Kethral's voice amplified through a translator drone, demanding her surrender. She did not answer him. She sat with Sergeant on the cold black stone, and the wind blew her wild hair across her face, and she was so tired that the fear had burned away to nothing, and all that was left was a calm that felt like the inside of a held breath. She looked at Sergeant, and he looked at her with his black eyes that had never once looked away from her since the day she dragged him bleeding out of the jungle. "Good boy," she said. "You are so good." Sergeant licked her hand and growled at the lights below and pressed himself closer against her, and together they waited on the top of the world for whatever came next. Commander Adaizi Okonkwo was drinking coffee in her quarters aboard the UHN Carthage when the call came through from the bridge, and the voice on the other end was the kind of tightly controlled calm that military officers used when something very bad had happened, and they were trying not to scream. "Captain, we have intercepted an emergency broadcast from the Verath system on the civilian distress frequency. It is a child's voice, ma'am." Okonkwo set her coffee down and walked to the bridge, and by the time she got there, the entire command crew had gone silent, because the message was playing on the main speakers, and it filled the bridge with the voice of a girl who sounded very young and very tired and very far from anyone who could help her. "This is Mira Ose, Verath 9 Research Station 7. Coordinates follow. They killed everyone. The message repeated and repeated, and the bridge crew listened, and nobody moved until Okonkwo spoke. Her communications officer checked the voice analysis and said, "Between 8 and 10 years old, ma'am. The signal is being boosted through a deep space relay. Origin confirmed as Verath 9. And ma'am, the Velthari Dominion has a fleet presence in that system, according to our last intelligence update." Okonkwo stood very still for 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, she made a decision that would be debated in the halls of the Galactic Union Assembly, and in human military courts, and in history textbooks, for longer than she would live. She turned to her navigation officer and said, "Plot a course for the Verath system, maximum burn." Her executive officer stepped forward and said quietly, "Captain, we do not have authorization to enter a Velthari claimed system. This would be an act of—" "I heard a child say they killed everyone," Okonkwo said, and her voice was the kind of quiet that made people stop talking. "Plot the course. The UHN. Carthage was a dreadnought, one of humanity's newest and most powerful warships, built in the orbital yards of Mars by engineers who had grown up on a planet where everything from the weather to the bacteria to the other humans had been trying to kill them for 200,000 years, and who had designed their warships accordingly. She was not elegant, and she was not beautiful, and the alien species who had seen her schematics during a Galactic Union technology exchange had described her as a weapon that someone accidentally built a ship around. This was accurate. The Carthage and her escort group, 2 heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers, went to full burn and crossed 3 star systems in 14 hours. And when they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Verath system, they did it the way humans did everything that mattered, hard and fast, and without any particular interest in being polite about it. The Veltari occupation fleet was not. They had been sitting in orbit for weeks, with nothing to do but support ground operations against a colony that had already fallen. And their defensive posture was lazy, and their formations were loose, and when 7 human warships appeared on their sensors without warning, the fleet commander had approximately 90 seconds to feel surprise before the Carthage opened fire. Human weapons technology was a subject of quiet concern among the more observant species of the Galactic Union, because humans did not design weapons the way other species did. Other species designed weapons to win battles. Humans designed weapons to make sure that whatever they were pointed at stopped existing. The Carthage's main batteries were magnetic accelerator cannons that fired tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of the speed of light. And when those slugs hit the Veltari flagship, they went through its shields and through its armor and through the other side and kept going. And the flagship broke apart in a bloom of atmosphere and debris that scattered across low orbit like a second ring around the planet. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Veltari fleet was wreckage, and the Carthage was broadcasting on all frequencies in the Veltari military language, a message that translated roughly to leave or join them. The surviving Veltari ships left. On the ground, Kethral received word that the fleet was gone at the same moment that his soldiers reported something falling from the sky. Drop pods. They came down like meteors, burning through the atmosphere in streaks of orange fire, and they hit the ground around the spire in a ring of impacts that shook the earth, and split trees, and threw Veltari soldiers off their feet. The pods opened, and human marine raiders came out. If the Veltari had been frightened by a 9-year-old girl and a honey badger, they were in no way prepared for what combat-armored human marines looked like up close. The raiders were big even by human standards, encased in powered exoskeletal armor that made them bigger, and they moved through the jungle with a speed and violence that made the Velthari's organized formations look like parade drills. They did not negotiate, and they did not hesitate, and they did not stop. Kethral tried to organize a defensive line, and the Marines went through it like it was not there, not because the Velthari soldiers were weak, but because the humans were fighting with something that the Velthari had never encountered in any of their wars of conquest. They were angry. Word had spread through the Marine Company during the drop about what they were coming down to find: a child, alone on a death world, hunted by an alien army. And human soldiers who heard that kind of thing did not respond with tactical calculation. They responded with fury. The Velthari line broke in minutes, and Kethral's armies scattered into the jungle, where the jungle did what the jungle had been doing for weeks, and ate them. A squad of raiders reached the summit of the spire, using climbing equipment and grapple lines, and the squad leader, a sergeant named Torres, pulled herself over the ledge and stopped. Sitting on the cold stone in front of the relay booster was a child. She was small and thin and covered in mud and blood, and her clothes were rags, and her hair was a wild tangle, and she had cuts and burns all over her body, and she was holding a gray-brown animal in her lap that was snarling at Torres with its teeth bared and its hackles raised. Around her on the stone were the remains of 3 Velthari drones that she had destroyed with rocks and a sharpened stick that lay beside her. And Torres looked at the drones, and looked at the stick, and looked at the child, and felt something move in her chest that she would never be able to put into words. Torres said softly, "We are here. You are safe now." Mira looked at her with eyes that were too old for her face, and she did not move. Sergeant lunged and bit Torres on the hand, hard, right through her armored glove, and Torres did not pull away because the briefing had mentioned the honey badger, and she understood. Mira put her hand on Sergeant's back and said in a voice that was hoarse and small and steady, "It is okay, Sergeant. They are ours." Sergeant let go of Torres and looked at Mira, and then looked at Torres, and then settled back into Mira's lap, still growling, but no longer biting. And Torres knelt down and very carefully picked up both the child and the animal and carried them down the spire. Kethral was captured 2 hours later, found by a marine patrol hiding in a drainage culvert, with his antenna flat and his weapon abandoned. And when he was brought to the Carthage in restraints and led before Commander Okonkwo, he looked through the window of the briefing room and saw the child sitting on a medical cot in the corridor, with the gray-brown animal curled at her feet and a marine medic treating her wounds, while she ate something from a ration pack. With the focused intensity of someone who had not had real food in weeks. Kethral looked at the child for a long time, and then he turned to Okonkwo and said through the translator device, "What are you people?" Okonkwo did not answer, because the door to the briefing room was open, and Mira had heard the question. She looked up from the ration pack, and her eyes met the Veltari overseer's, the same eyes he had seen in that blurred drone image weeks ago. And she said in a voice that carried the weight of everything she had survived, "We are from Earth. We do not leave our own behind." Kethral had no response to this. The Varath 9 incident, as it came to be known, changed the shape of galactic politics in ways that no one predicted. Could no longer treat humanity as a minor species to be humored and ignored, because the footage from the Carthage's combat recorders and the marine helmet cameras was released to the Union Assembly, and every species in the galaxy watched a 9-year-old human child wage a one-creature guerrilla war against a professional army, and win. The Velthari Dominion, humiliated beyond anything their hive pride could process, agreed to a ceasefire, and withdrew from 3 contested systems, because the alternative was fighting a species that apparently raised its children on death worlds, and considered this normal. Mira Osei was awarded the Terran Star, the highest civilian honor for bravery, in a ceremony that was broadcast across human space, and she stood at the podium in a dress that her new guardian had picked out for her, and she held the medal and said thank you, and then she looked down at Sergeant, who was sitting on the stage beside her, wearing a custom-forged medal of his own, a collar that he had already tried to chew off 3 times. Commander Okonkwo adopted Mira, because some things do not need to be discussed or debated. They simply need to happen, and Mira grew up on starships, surrounded by Marines who treated her like a little sister, and a honey badger who treated everyone else like a potential threat. Sargent lived another 19 years, because gene-modded honey badgers were tough, and because stubbornness was a force that even biology had to respect. And he never once left Mira's side. On the last page of the incident report filed by Sergeant Torres, the Marine who had pulled Mira off the spire, there was a handwritten note that was not part of the official record, but that was passed around Marine barracks for years afterward. It said, "I have served with the best soldiers humanity has ever produced, and I have never met anything braver than that kid and her badger. And if you disagree, you can take it up with Sergeant, the badger, not me, and see how that goes for you." Years later, a woman stood on the bridge of her own warship, Commander Mira Osei of the UHN Defiance, and she looked out at the stars with the steady calm of someone who had seen the worst the universe could offer, and had answered it with stubbornness and fury and love. On the deck beside her, old and gray-muzzled and missing most of one ear, and scarred from a dozen battles he should not have survived, Sargent lay with his chin on his paws, and his black eyes half-closed, and a low rumble in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr. A young ensign walked too close to Mira's command chair, and Sargent opened one eye, and the ensign decided very quickly that he had business on the other side of the bridge. Mira smiled and reached down and scratched the spot behind his remaining ear, and Sargent's back leg kicked, and for a moment they were not a decorated commander and a legendary war animal, and her badger, the same as they had always been. Across the galaxy, in the military academies of the Veltari Dominion, a new lesson was taught to every hatchling soldier. A lesson that had been paid for in blood and humiliation, and the kind of fear that an empire built on conquest had never expected to feel. The lesson was simple, and it was delivered as a warning, and it was never forgotten. Do not hunt what does not fear you.